Howdy, I'm Clay with Bear Builds, and this is how I remodeled my parents' dining room. Getting right into it, the dining room had a chair rail that needed to be removed, so I started by cutting the caulk and removing the trim with a hammer and a pry bar. The trim removal left the walls pretty messy in a few spots, so I figured it would be easier to use masonite to cover the walls since I'm not very good at taping and floating drywall. As mentioned earlier, this is my parents' dining room, so I got their input on what they wanted in there, and we both agreed that the board and batten walls would look great. There were a lot of different angles and sizes at play for this dining room, so I used an online cut optimizer program to figure out the size of each panel. I figured out which cuts needed to be made on each sheet and used construction adhesive and brad nails to put them into place. There were a few spots I needed to account for plugs and light switches, so I measured where they landed on the panel and used an oscillating multi-tool to cut out a hole. There was a lot of brad nailing these panels into place, and you can see that I even put the masonite behind where the doorway trim was going, since it was going to be flush with the wall panels. You can see that I used 1x6s as base for the wall panels and used some masonite to create a gap between the flooring and the base itself. The same practice of adhesive and then nailing applied to the trim as well. There were a few spots where the trim went vertical due to some of the stairs that go from the entry landing into the dining room, but for the most part, I only had to worry about each of the angles at the wall corners. After finishing the base and door trim, I had reference points to install the middle, top, and corner trim for each of the wall panels. One of the most frustrating parts of this project was that none of the wall angles were the same and required new measurements for each piece or pieces being installed. Installing the vertical corner pieces was one of my favorite stages of the job because it really started looking closer to the finished product. The outside corners required perfect angle measurements, but on the inside corners, I was able to hide the angles, so I ended up doing 90s. The window sills were a little more guess and check, where I had to get an initial measurement, see how much of a reveal there was between the drywall and the trim, and then pretty it all up with a jigsaw. I also installed a quarter round base to hide any of the gaps between the 1x6 base and the flooring. Once these were installed, I was able to caulk the inside of each panel. After I was done caulking, I used spackle to fill the rest of the nail holes and sanded all of them down with a sanding sponge. I also put up plastic sheeting around the doorways and vacuumed up all the dust to prevent it from spreading throughout the house. I wanted the paint to adhere well to the trim, panels, and walls, so I went over everything with 2 coats of water-based primer. I hand brushed wherever there was trim or if it was a wall corner, and primed most of the walls and panels with a 9-inch roller brush. When it came to painting the wall panels, I used Behr's Premium Plus Semi-Gloss, which is what I normally use whenever I do trim work. After the trim and panels had dried, I used painter's tape to protect them from the paint I used on the walls. My parents' house is mostly painted with Sherwin-Williams Accessible Beige, so I had a gallon of Behr Premium Plus Eggshell color matched. I enlisted the help of my girlfriend and my dad for painting, and while the paint was still wet, I pulled off the painter's tape so they wouldn't stick together. All that was left to do after that was match the crown molding to the rest of the trim, and the dining room was done.